Hello, God bless you, and welcome to episode 69 of Unshackled Life Q&A. My name is Dalen Woodard, and I'm a Bible teacher and assistant pastor at Nacogdoches Christian Fellowship and founder of Unshackled Life Ministries in Nacogdoches, Texas. I'm someone who's been set free from a hopeless state of mind and body, spiritual bondage, and addictions by the grace and truth of God. These Q&As cover questions about God, the Bible, theology, and walking with Jesus. We'll examine the questions from a biblical perspective and using biblical thinking, meaning approaching the question from a biblical worldview and using the text in context with the passage where it's found, as well as trying to keep it in context and agreement with the entirety of Scripture. Also, I'd like to thank the person who asked the question we'll be covering today. So let's get to it. Question. In John chapter 20, verse 17, Jesus tells Mary not to cling to him because he hasn't ascended to the Father. In John 20, verse 27, Jesus tells Thomas to put his fingers in the wounds on his hands and to take his hand and place it in his side. Why did he give permission for Thomas to touch him and not Mary? Was it because he already knew Thomas's response? This is both a good question and a timely one with Holy Week and Resurrection Sunday quickly approaching. I also really appreciated the last part of the question, because that was an interesting concept I needed to chew on a little. And I like questions that make me think, so I'll address that first. And the answer is, I don't think it would have to do with Jesus knowing how Thomas would respond, being about why him and not Mary, at least in one way. But I do think you are onto something in that Jesus, knowing full well that Thomas would respond the way he did, with belief and faith, made the offer. That said, if the reasoning is used for someone to say Jesus didn't allow either of them to touch him, Mary not being allowed to touch because she was told not to, and Thomas not allowed to touch even though he was invited to because Jesus knew that Thomas would worship instead of touching, that I would say is most certainly not the reason Jesus told Thomas yes and Mary no. If that was all we had, then the idea that Jesus simply gave an invitation he knew Thomas wouldn't accept might be the answer. Jesus didn't actually let Thomas touch him. But there are two problems with this idea. One, regardless of the fact that Jesus knew how Thomas would respond, he made the invitation, meaning Thomas was free to choose to touch. So in a very true sense, Jesus did allow Thomas to touch. On the same side of that coin is the fact that Jesus also knew how Mary was going to react to seeing him. So that raises the question of, since Jesus started the conversation with Mary by warning her not to touch him because of the ascension, wouldn't that mean no one could touch him? And that's the main reason I reject this possibility and perspective, because Jesus was touched multiple times by multiple people after the resurrection. Luke 24:39 makes it clear that Jesus invited all the disciples to touch him, not just Thomas. But like with the situation with Mary and Thomas in John 20, the text does not indicate if Jesus was actually touched or not. Now, many assume Mary did touch Jesus, explaining the difference between Thomas and Mary having to do with how she was holding on to him, as though she is already clinging to Jesus, which is not what the text says, while simultaneously assuming the opposite with Thomas. He fell to his knees and did not touch Jesus. But the text doesn't say what Thomas did, only what he said. He may have fallen on his face, but we aren't actually told that, and we are not told that he didn't touch Jesus before making that exclamation. All I'm saying is that we cannot, from the text alone, know if either Mary or Thomas, or in the case of Luke 24, the other disciples, actually touched Jesus. So why did I say he was touched? Well, Matthew tells us that Jesus was touched. In Matthew 28:9, we see the encounter between the resurrected Jesus and some of the women who followed him. And they, according to the text, did indeed touch his feet as they worshipped. But there is no rebuke, no mention of touching Jesus not being allowed. Rather, we are only told that they are told to go and tell. There's a lot of telling that needed to be done and fast once that tomb emptied. Finally, from John, the author of the gospel the question comes from. In 1 John 1:11, the apostle tells us that the disciples both saw the resurrected Jesus with their eyes and handled or touched him with their hands. This may refer to the encounters I already mentioned or to others off the record, but here John verifies the fact of the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ based upon multiple disciples having touched him. So we know it was possible to touch Jesus, and that it was good and right to touch him, at least in certain times and ways, even after the resurrection. So that takes us back to the start with the question, in light of the fact that it was okay to touch Jesus, and that Jesus even invited Thomas and the other disciples to do so, why would he not allow Mary to touch him? First, this was not about being or staying clean. It wasn't a holiness issue. The Gospels make it very clear throughout that when Jesus encounters the unclean, he isn't the one affected. The unclean is made clean. Nor is that out of his control. So don't go the opposite way that some do and say he was trying to keep her from becoming too clean, too holy to live on this earth. That's superstitious nonsense that's proved false by the very fact that Jesus lived a perfect, holy life on earth for over 3 decades. You can never be too holy or clean before God. The answer has to do with the idea of clinging and how it relates to the ascension. Many believe the answer is in motivation. Mary is desperate not to lose Jesus again, now that she realizes he's alive, much like someone who nearly loses someone else extremely close or important to them may react from the near miss by not letting them out of their sight easily for a while. I'm just too scared to lose you, so I won't let you go, won't let you out of my sight again ever. This is where I think you may have really been onto something with the question, was it because he knew how Thomas would respond? I think the answer is yes, but not exactly. I think it was because he knew how Mary would respond, or rather, how they both would respond, so he approached them as individuals. Jesus says, I am not ascended, but am ascending. That's the feel of the ascension aspect of his discussion with Mary. Everything isn't done, but I've got things to do, and oh, so do you. Go and tell. The King James Version and some others do have this word translated as touch, but cling or hold on is a more accurate understanding. I think there are 2 best probabilities, and that the answer is likely to be a combination of the 2. First, it could be on the level of Thomas and be all about faith. Thomas needed the faith to grab hold, and Mary needed the faith to let go. Mary, me walking around like this isn't the plan. You've got to let me go to the Father. You can't hold on to me that way. My physical presence is not what your faith is going to be clinging to, so don't cling to this body. Whereas Thomas needed to see and understand the reality that the body before him was real and belonged to Jesus, so he could grab onto the truth of who Jesus is, namely, Lord and God. If that idea is correct, then it would be absolutely accurate to say that Jesus told one to touch and the other not to because he knew how each would respond, because he also knew what each of them needed to strengthen their faith. Mary obeyed and told, and Thomas worshipped. The other possibility, and again, these are not mutually exclusive, is simply, we don't have time for this. I know you want to hold on to me yourself, but I have things to do and things for you to do. Let go and go tell. In this possibility, you see basically the same thing as in Matthew, where there is no rebuke, but simply the instruction to go and tell. I like this because I personally feel we're reading way too much into this when we read the words of Jesus to Mary as either rebuke or rejection. It's more likely it would have been less rebuke, no rejection, and simply an okay, let's get busy. I really think it was probably both of these ideas. There is one more possibility that is at least somewhat valid. I believe it's less likely than the above, but it actually isn't mutually exclusive either, and both the above could be correct and this play a factor. I don't know how likely this actually is, but I do think it's far more likely than the idea that she was unclean so she couldn't touch Jesus, which is pretty much the exact opposite of the gospel message and theme of Scripture. The idea is that Jesus wasn't saying no. He was saying later. With that, I am not ascending but am ascending, go tell the others, comes the idea, proved out in Scripture, that he wants to spend time with them all before he ascends. With this idea in place, some feel it's possible that Jesus was saying, Mary, there'll be time for that later. There's still time. I am not yet ascended. Don't fear. You'll have time with me. Now, I do think this less likely than the idea that she needed to understand that the relationship with Jesus wasn't going to be physical. But that doesn't mean Jesus wasn't also assuring her that there was time to spend with him, and she would have all she needed. I don't really care for this one because it implies that later she would have been able to just cling to him physically for a while, and I don't see that happening for multiple reasons. I really think it was Jesus telling someone who didn't understand, hey, I'm alive, but what we had before, me walking and talking physically with you, that's not the way it's going to stay, so don't be clinging to me like that and trying to hold me physically to you or with you. That's fear, not faith. Besides, I have something really important for you to do. Go and tell my brothers, my disciples. And I will die on the hill that it was not in any way Jesus saying, I am too holy or you are too unclean to take hold of me. Jesus touched lepers and made them clean. He touched the dead and made them live. He is God. You can't make him unclean. And the entire point of the cross is that no one is too unclean to come to Jesus. Not before the cross with the lepers and adulterers and traitors, not on the cross with the thief who was saved, not after the cross with Paul and I, co-chiefs of sinners, not for women, men, or any other category. The whole reason he came is so we could all come. You and I can reach out and touch Jesus and not be rebuked or rejected. But don't be surprised if he says, okay, enough just me and you time. Go and tell. All right. Thank you for listening. I hope the answer to today's question helped you in some way. If you have a question about God, the Bible, or theology, you can email your question to DalenWoodard@minister.com. That's DalenWoodard@minister.com. Or go to the Unshackled Life Ministries Facebook page and ask there or through DM. Find me, Dalen Woodard, on X and ask there or reply to this video on YouTube. May the Lord bless you and keep you and give you an ever-deepening hunger for His Word. Help us spread the Word by sharing, commenting, and clicking that like button on YouTube. Keep up to date on the Q&As and the Bible teaching by subscribing to this channel. And remember, when you fix your thoughts on God and build your thinking on the foundation of His truth, God fixes your thoughts. Be blessed.